Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 68th video in our Master Series, the 37th video in our first phase processing, and we're going to talk about panning our instruments in our stereo field. So the first thing that's happening here is that you're going to have two things you're dealing with when you're dealing with stereo field. It's a real basic thing of panning things to where you want them placed in the stereo field. So besides that, besides center to right and left, you also have a depth aspect. So some of this is going to come into play when you start mixing, because at this point you want to get a general idea. If we already did this work here with doubling tracks, spatialization, and things like that. And this can also be part of that. Remember, we had talked about if you want a track panned left, that you might want to double the track onto the right also and pan the same amount but turned way down to add depth to the mix. So it fills out the mix a little bit more. With some of the work we talked about in this step being done on that duplicated track. But, just the panning itself, that other than that it's a pretty simple concept. To really get too in depth to what is happening there can be very difficult, because it can be so different with so many different productions. You can have, if you look at, like an orchestra or something like that, you've got a couple different things happening. You've got where they're panned in the stereo field and depth. Basically, for the most part, that's what's happening. You can get some binaural effects. I have an effect from Sennheiser that'll actually set at different levels. So it'll sound like it's lower or even higher. And that can get pretty complicated. So if you get into that, there are some plugins that'll do that, but that's pretty detailed processing, and the work that they've been able to do on it to make it sound really good when you've got a big production going on is debatable. So, but I do have one that does pretty good. So you might want to look around and see if you couldn't come up with some of that like that if that interests you. But the basic concept's pretty simple. You have, where is it panned to? How far is it back compared to the other instruments? So you're not only going to have it panned off from a center somewhere, but also it's going to come down in decibel level to make it sound like it's farther away. Besides the reverberation work that we talked about, we made a preset of to add to it also, that's also going to come into play when that's added to it. You're going to drop the volume level of it to try to make it sound like it's farther back in the stereo field, and also you're going to be adding that echo delay effect with the reverberation that's chosen for the production to it in various degrees, more or less, depending on how far back you're trying to push that instrument. Being very careful not to add a bunch to it to make it sound muddy, because half the battle is just getting the volume level set right to make it sound like this instrument here is farther forward in the mix than this instrument, which first step is to reduce the volume of this instrument back here to make it sound farther back, and then using the preset we talked about with our reverberation and echo effects to try to enhance that, to make it sound like it's back there, but it's blending into the mix, but at a farther distance away, which is a work in progress, and it takes time. That whole process, like I said, with most of this kind of stuff, is be real careful and go light with any processing you do so that you don't cause mud in your mix. You want the processing we do with reverberations and echo effects, like we talked about in reverberation, that's going to add it, that's going to blend it in and glue it together with the rest of the instruments where you've panned them and at what depths you've put them in with your volumes. But go light. Go really light so you don't start causing a lot of mud to where you can't really tell that this instrument is back farther than this instrument or this instrument's back farther than this instrument. It sounds a little quieter, but it's gotten muddy because of the processing you've done on it, and it really isn't, you're not getting depth, you're getting mud. So be real careful of that. But the biggest concern and the biggest advice is that you just study it. Look around on the internet for stereo field pictures of where things are panned in orchestras, anything like this. It's saying, okay, I've got my high guitar, my low guitar, my synth solos over here. this is off to kind of the right, but at an angle a little bit because I don't want to write directly at the left. I'm working with stereo in front of me, so that's not going to work anyway, and download pictures of that and really study that. Even something simple like drums, drums and a bass, I'll have normally like my kick drum is center. It just almost always center if it's a normal like band. Does that make sense? I'm never going to duplicate my kick drum. I mean, maybe on occasion if I want it to be really have some impact for one break or one transition or something like that, but it's mostly center. And the bass in comparison to that, unless I got panned off to one side or the other, I'm either going to pan it off to the side, maybe 20 or 30% one side or another, so it doesn't interfere with instruments between like the guitars and the piano at 50 and 50, and the vocals panned out a little farther to get them a more a heavier stereo field effect. And maybe front to back, maybe back. The more instruments you have and the bigger stereo field you have to start putting things in the stereo field and behind other instruments, it's just more detailed work, and normally anytime you got anything like that happening, my best advice is let's say I got the piano and the guitar. The piano is panned, 50% right, let's say, and there's one guitar that's panned 75% right. So if I've got something that I want at a lower decibel level that's back behind them, I'm going to put it somewhere in between that 75 and that 50% panned right place, so it's in between there. It's farther back, but it's also between there. So it's got a little bit of space to come through at you. So that's a huge concept to practice with and really get used to, because all you have is stereo right to left. So, any spot you've got things going, 20% right, 25% right, 30% right, 35% right, 40% right. The more things you have, you're panning them in different places. Especially if you got things behind other things that you don't want those both panned 50% right. One of them might be 50% right, but one of them might only be 40% right, because you're going to have them back a little farther, and you want them to be divided a little bit in their panning to give them a little area to come through at the listener, besides you dropping them in level a little bit. So that's a huge concept to get used to working and using when you're working in some type of music production and dealing with your stereo field. But there's lots of things that you can get to start working on that and looking at that and begin thinking that out. And it's a really good idea to take a look at your track, take a look at your arrangement that you have, and when you start to do that, write it out. Write things out. Where do I want the vocal? I've doubled this track, so it's here and there, 40% right and 40% left, and then I've got this other thing at 35% left because it's in the background, but I don't want it at 40 or 50. I want it in between there, so it has a little space to come through, and draw it out. Really sit down and draw it out and really think about those concepts in depth and spend some time. The more instruments you have, the harder it is. And if you got instruments behind instruments that you're trying to make them sound deeper and farther back in the mix, that like an orchestral thing or a half orchestra or a third orchestra that's almost like an ensemble but fairly large, or a big pop production that you've got all kinds of stuff going on, that you being able to separate those out in those pannings so that they all have their own little space in the panning, so that when you drop them farther back with the decibel levels, that they've got someplace to cut through to get to the listener, so they're not right directly behind. It's like you don't want to put the bass amplifier right behind the guitar amplifier. I mean, you just don't want to do that. You want to have it off, a little bit off of it. Does that make sense? So the bass guitar isn't going to be right behind it's going to be off here, so that would be maybe 75% right, this guitar, but the bass or the piano would be 60% right. And the more you divide that panning, trying to build that, your panning this way and your depth, and have space between there for things to come through, is some of the biggest concepts you have to work on. And the best advice is that there's not any real concrete advice on that. There's all kinds of people will tell you how you kind of want to pan things out to try to get things panned where they want. My biggest advice is that don't come in too far to center with most things unless you're dealing with something like a bass, or a kick drum, and you want very little delay between we did that spatialization work, and you want to give it body, so you've got it 10% right and 10% left, and you've doubled that track, but you've got very little delay on it, that's just adding body to it. Does that make sense? And basses are the same kind of thing. If you duplicate bass tracks and you maybe go up 20% right and 20% left, but no more than that, and very little delay on one track from the other, like we talked about in the last two videos, and reducing the level of one of them just slightly, because that and panning all the way out. Sometimes you'll get things, I'll go 95% right or left max, and sometimes I'll go a little farther, but almost never go all the way 100% right or left. For some reason, it gets this sound like it's right on the edge of the dang speaker that doesn't sound quite right, unless I've got a really super full production, like at least a half an orchestra or a third orchestra or a pop production or some big production that's got a lot going on in it, so that it's not perceivable, because otherwise it just sounds like it's too far right and left for some reason, no matter what you do. I mean, you even point the speakers right directly at you, right, and you're like, it still sounds like it's panned funky, way too far right and left. So we recommend 95 right or left about as far as I go, unless it's a really super full production. So there's lots of things that people will give you advice on this, but the biggest thing is find its panning place, have its own panning place, right or left or wherever, and and your depth, reducing the volume. Sometimes it doesn't take much to give that depth, because sometimes you don't want a mile between the oboe and the clarinet. They're not that far apart. You don't want them to feel like they're that far apart. Sometimes you do, and you got to work with that. But really keep in mind, when you drag out that preset with that reverberation and echo effects that we did to try to create the space that the production is going to be living in, that adding that in a little bit more to those ones that are farther back, but not much. I mean, not much. Don't go heavy on that. Go light, because you're just trying to enhance the effect that it's a little farther back on the stage. Does that make sense? Like when you're looking at, any type of an orchestra situation, that it's not miles back there, and you don't want it to get muddy, because if you got all these things back here and you start adding tons of reverb on them, and it's a big pop production or a fairly good sized orchestral production, it's going to cause mud in your mix. So just remember, you might add it pretty light on the things up front, and just add just a little bit more as things goes back, and as you drop decibel levels, to drop things back into the background. Just go really light. Don't add very much more. Go real light. It might sound like it needs more if you listen to it by itself, but when you put the whole production together, that it's probably not going to sound like that, because when that all convolves together into a mix, into one sound that is your production, that all that multiple of spatialization stuff is going to multiply and combine and glue the mix together and add upon the effect. Every one of them that you've done that to is going to multiply together to add more spatialization. And as that does that, if you've added too much, it will cause a lot of mud in your mix. So just remember, go light, listen to it. You can always add more, just be careful. And the panning thing is a work in progress that you need to experiment with. Panning things around, working on your doubling of tracks, panning things around to where they sound good. Am I going to go 50 or 50-50? Am I going to go 40-40? You get under 40 down to 30 or 30 right or left, or you get above 95% right or left, that you're getting into a danger zone that can cause mud. And, and it's not really going to add a spatialization effect unless you got a big production where something panned 20% right or left with that full thing that you're doing, because it's a lot of stuff going on, can make the difference, because it gives it a space to cut through that it's not right behind something else. So keep that in mind and experiment. And it should become very obvious as you study that and you think about it, that where you put things is an artistic decision. Just remember, don't cover things up and don't cause too much mud, and do it the way you want to do it, to where it comes out sounding good to you. So peace out, love. I hope you enjoyed this video on panning your instruments in your stereo field and spatialization. And I'll see you in the next video when we finalize our first phase processing. And remember that this is all just a guesstimate, because when you get into mixing, you might change your mind. Peace out, love. See you in the next video.